November 1992, somewhere off the coast of Cyprus in the Mediterranean Sea. Kismetim means my destiny or my fate in Turkish, but it's also the name of a massive cargo ship that's been making its way from Karachi, Pakistan to Turkey before it eventually heads to Europe. Except it might not get there, because this particular ship is being monitored by Turkish counter-narcotics police with some help from the DEA. See, that ship? It's believed to contain some hidden product belonging to a man named Huseyin Baybasin. He's the feared patriarch of a family of Kurds from the southeast of Turkey. And this family, they move a phenomenal amount of heroin in Britain, Turkey, Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and Spain. They've been power players since the 1970s, bringing in and refining opium from Afghanistan that gets smuggled out through Iran and into Turkey and then Europe. In fact, some people take to calling Hussein the heroin emperor, and years later, a British journalist writing of his estimated $10 billion fortune will dub him the Pablo Escobar of Europe. In North London, where he eventually sets up a stronghold to control the English heroin trade, the Kurdish and Turkish immigrant community will speak of him and his clan in hushed tones, referring to them only as the family. For this moment right now, though, he's got close to 7,000 pounds of morphine base he plans to refine into heroin on this cargo ship that's now being surrounded by the Turkish Coast Guard backed by a U.S. Navy destroyer. It looks like he's about to get caught red-handed with enough product to put him away for a very long time. But Hussein didn't get to where he is by falling apart under pressure. He's not on the ship, but he calls the captain and tells him, sink it, along with all of the product. You know when drug dealers flush their stuff down the toilet when the cops knock on the door? This is that, except with hundreds of millions of dollars instead of 20 grams. The reason we know this is that the ship's captain admits to it under interrogation, though he still claims there were no drugs on board, which means, I guess, he sank the ship for fun. Either way, the authorities don't find anything. Less than 2 weeks later, a minor drug trafficker who had a small amount of product also on the ship is murdered in Istanbul when he's in a car with his wife and 2 daughters on the way to a wedding. Huseyin Baybasin, though, he gets away this time. But worse than losing his product, he's now notorious and on everyone's radar, as the story makes headlines around the world. It also fuels speculation about his influence and connections, the fact that he was capable of orchestrating something so complex. See, this story goes way deeper than the tale of a very successful heroin trafficker. There's way more at play here. It involves state secrets in Turkey, a militant guerrilla group waging a 40-year insurrection, massive conspiracies and international intrigue involving the Turkish deep state, spy agencies of multiple countries, including Britain, informants, billions of dollars, one of the most powerful criminal families in Europe and Asia, and control of over 90% of the heroin flooding into the UK. To quote a 2006 article from The Guardian, Huseyin Baybasin never made any secret of the sort of man he was, nor about the way he made his fortune. He would chat happily to criminologists about his control over the river of opium, which flows from Afghanistan, crossing his extended family's lands around the small town of Lice in southeast Turkey before being processed as heroin for markets in the West. It is one of the least developed areas of Turkey, and the Baybasin clan is enormous, straddling several international borders and feared. Many of its male members have long criminal records. In interviews with journalists, Hussein portrayed himself as a kind of international man of violence, a gangster who had financed both the Turkish ruling classes and the separatists of the Kurdish Workers' Party, or PKK, and who would not hesitate to order the killing of those who insulted his honor. I would travel with a gun in one hand and a diplomatic passport in the other, he boasted. It's a story that's still playing out, violently, all around the world today. This is the Underworld Podcast. Welcome back, friends, to the audio experience that takes you on a journey through the vast criminal underworlds located all over the globe. Every week, 2 journalists who have been reporting on this stuff for nearly 2 decades God, we are old. Myself, Danny Gold, and my co-host, Sean Williams, switch off hosting duties while the other occasionally joins in with some valuable insight or a truly awful attempt at making a joke. Sean, have you recovered yet from your trip to the States? Because I have not, trying to keep up with you.
I mean, I'll tell you what I haven't recovered from, Danny. That fifth inning. Am I right?
God, brutal series for the Yanks.
Absolutely
and it will never
terrible.
cease to amaze me how much an Englishman like Sean loves baseball. As always, we have bonus episodes and interviews at patreon.com/underworldpodcast, or you can sign up with our pals at Spotify or on iTunes for more, including a new thing we are doing where Sean and I discuss the sort of, craziest or biggest organized crime stories out that week. It's loose. We're not doing a ton of research on this stuff, but just giving you our opinions, I guess. We've got merch at underworldpod.com. Email us at theunderworldpodcast@gmail.com if you have ideas or complaints or anything else. What else? Oh, if you can hook us up with the Grand Theft Auto people at Rockstar Games. We want to become a radio station on Grand Theft Auto 6. It's sort of our latest Hail Mary attempt to try to pay off gambling debts that Sean got when he was addicted to betting podcast money on the over and WNBA games.
Yeah, sorry about that. I mean, it turns out the Baton Rouge Swamp Gators weren't even a real team either. So thanks for that one, XBet.
Yeah. Now, on to the insane story of Huseyin Baybasin, dubbed Europe's Pablo Escobar by the English media and the heroin emperor by others, as well as the godfather of the family, which, solid nicknames throughout, but kind of lacking in originality.
Yeah, Baybasin. Baybasin. I think you've got it. I think we're going to get fewer emails than usual for this one.
I mean, Turkish, the S has got a squiggle over it. It's a tough thing to to nail down for an uncultured American like myself.
Yeah, that's squiggleless.
I do wish I had more time for this episode, for this one. There's so many murky details and rumors, while also having to navigate Turkish politics in the 80s and 90s, which is kind of a nightmare to figure out. And then we need to get into the Turkey-Kurdish conflict, the PKK, and a whole bunch of other stuff that if I went into too much detail on, it would likely turn into like a Dan Carlin 7-hour history class. There's also a lot of conflicting information, but we will do our best to navigate it. The story of the Baybasin family is deeply intertwined with the complex dynamics of Kurds in Turkey. So to get into this, we kind of need to establish first an understanding of who the Kurds are and where they come from. Now, my career doing international and war reporting, actually, I spent a lot of time in Kurdish areas in the beginning of it. It was the first conflict I reported on. The first big reporting trip I ever took was in 2012 to Iraqi Kurdistan and then Syrian Kurdistan, aka Rojava, on the same trip. And the second trip was in the Kurdish areas of Turkey, the southeast of the country, and then again to Syrian Kurdistan. The Kurds are an ethnic group currently concentrated in regions of Iran, Syria, Turkey, and Iraq, and they've been historically oppressed and massacred in all of them for generations. Turkey's fought a particularly brutal war against them, though Saddam Hussein actually used mustard gas on Iraqi Kurds and killed somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 of them in a day or two. In fact, Turkey is actually still regularly bombing Kurds in 3 countries at the moment, in Turkey, in Syria, and Iraq. And if you want more Kurdish history, Quill Lawrence's book, Invisible Nation, is a great primer on it. It's focused, I believe, mostly on Iraqi Kurds, if you're interested. And Eliza Marcus wrote a thorough book on the PKK, so you can look that up. The PKK, or Kurdistan Workers' Party, they've been fighting this insurrection against the Turkish government for, I think, a little bit over 40 years. They were founded by Abdullah Öcalan, aka Apo, and were originally a Marxist-Leninist militant organization, but have since moderated a bit into something called Democratic Confederalism. I was actually in the southeast of Turkey in Diyarbakir in 2013 when they signed a peace treaty with the Turkish government, but that unfortunately didn't last too long. Many of you have also probably heard of the YPG, who are the Syrian wing of the PKK. They got a ton of attention in Western media starting around 2014. The U.S. also allied with them to fight ISIS. Now, going back for decades, the PKK has faced accusations of drug trafficking for financing for decades, mostly along the Balkan route, which took opium and heroin from Afghanistan over the mountains from Iran into southeast Turkey and then into Europe. The Turkish government also considered them to be terrorists, as does Europe and the U.S., even though the U.S. just partner with them, with their affiliate, basically. It's them. it is them, to fight ISIS. But yeah, the PKK has also not been shy on dispensing violence to people who get in their way.
The YPG are like the ones who have like female soldiers and officers, right? That was quite famous during the fight against ISIS. And are they completely different organizations to the PKK?
No, they're basically the Syrian wing of the PKK. And the PKK has had female officers and soldiers for a long time, like to the point where when people started writing articles about the YPG having female fighters, it was like a running joke in people who have covered that conflict for a while about the female fighters and all the articles about the female fighters. So but you're accurate in that. All right, so this is all very rudimentary, and I promise we will get to heroin and gang violence shortly. We're going to get a little more into drug trafficking accusations and all that and the Turkish deep state later on. I just wanted to get some basics sort of out of the way for people who might not be aware. We do, of course, post a reading list of sources in the Patreon, and who knows, maybe I'll post a bunch of my old articles hanging with the various Kurdish militants in Iraq, Syria, and Turkey up there as well.
Oh, hello.
So Huseyin Baybasin is born in Lice, Turkey in 1956, and his brother Abdullah is born 4 years later. It's a phenomenally poor Kurdish area of Turkey, somewhat close to the Syrian border, and it's marginalized and oppressed by the Turkish government. It's also unstable, tense, and violent, though the PKK won't exist for another 25 years or so. Like many people there, Hussein's parents are farmers, and they have a whole lot of kids. Lice, though, is a known center for smuggling, particularly opium and hash, either grown in Turkey or flowing out of Afghanistan, as well as other goods like tobacco and whatever else is sort of taxed. It's a crucial transit point. There's little government presence there and very little law and order. Some sources say Hussein's father, Saeed, using his family connections in the area and their knowledge of smuggling routes, soon got involved in the drug trade. Others have it that his uncle Mehmet started refining heroin in clandestine labs in small villages nearby in the early 1970s.
I mean, who doesn't have an Uncle Mehmet who's refining heroin in the village, right? I bet they all do out there. Bloody Uncle Mehmet.
We've all got an Uncle Mehmet in our family, you know? In 1975, an earthquake hits the area, devastating an already poor region. It kills 2,300 people, and this causes Hussein to move to Istanbul to chase opportunity, where he soon starts running in smuggling circles. And this information comes from a book by Ryan Gingeris, I think is his last name, titled Heroin, Organized Crime, and the Making of Modern Turkey.
Oh, nice. Yeah, we had Ryan on for a bonus like a billion years ago. I think it was like in the one we had about Sedat Peker about 2021 or so. I got Ryan on the show. He's really, really great.
He's, I think, the go-to guy when it comes to heroin in Turkey and sort of Turkish underworld figures. In 1976, when he's about 20, Hussein is arrested for smuggling 11 kilos of hash. I've also seen this reported as heroin, but I think it was hash. He serves a short sentence, and soon afterwards, he graduates to moving heroin. More history, I'm sorry guys, but at least it's drugs history. The Ottoman Empire, which precedes Turkey, was a major opium producer. The empire collapses post-World War I, and the state of Turkey arrives and stays a major producer. But the government basically takes over and tries to regulate it. And around then, you have the emergence of these local small-time traffickers, often from minority backgrounds, you know, like the Orthodox Christians and the Kurds as well. They basically serve as apprentices to these Western and Japanese companies that were controlling a lot of the trade legally and producing it in 3 big factories that are said to have alone contributed 1% of Turkey's GDP at the time. These groups mostly pull out in the 1930s. The factories shut down. This is due to international pressure. And these local traffickers emerge as, you know, the guys, especially after Iran, another major player in the international drug trade, bans producing it in 1955. That's, you know, producing opium. And of course, around then, you have this emergence of the infamous French Connection, which is where the Corsican mob smuggled Turkish heroin through Marseille, France, and into the US. Also, I still actually haven't seen the movie, which at this point, for someone who does this podcast, is shameful.
That is shameful. We should do a live viewing or something. Picking Your Feet in Poughkeepsie. Oh my God. That is like an all-time classic. All-time classic.
I know. The French Connection is a huge part of this, by the way. How it worked is that Turkish producers cultivated opium and then refined it into morphine base and eventually heroin. And it makes its way to Marseille, France, where the Corsican mob, who are insanely connected all over France and North America, bring it over to distributors. And it wreaks havoc. In the U.S., the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, which was, I think, around before the DEA, they're trying to shut things down, but the Turkish police are being less than helpful. There's a lot of corruption, and some high-level members of government and the security services were even suspected of being traffickers themselves. For example, in 1971, a Turkish senator is bagged carrying 146 kilos of morphine, which is quite a bit more than personal use unless you're a young Sean Williams in Berlin looking at a 3-day weekend.
Hey, yeah, following by 5 straight days of something I like to call the scaries, but yeah, those days are over-ish.
Also, in the mid-20th century, you have this new generation of drug lords emerging in Turkey. These guys are called the new Babas, and they build their empire through connections, ruthlessness, and exploitation of the already existing opium production in Turkey. This period marks a significant shift in the Turkish heroin trade, with these larger, more organized criminal syndicates taking control, utilizing these connections with politicians and law enforcement officials to just grow and thrive in the heroin trade. The Turkish government at times turns a blind eye to these activities, prioritizing other political and economic interests over cracking down on drug trafficking. It's around this time that our boy Hussein claims he's conscripted into the Turkish military and starts doing covert assignments for secret elements of the Turkish state in the military and the security services, all that, later acting as an informant on PKK activities, while allegedly he was also trafficking heroin with the help of the state and with the help of the PKK. Though all the timeline stuff it's funny. I wasn't able to confirm that he actually was in the Turkish military. There aren't a lot of details on that time period, but this is what he claims, and this alleged collaboration with elements of the Turkish state is going to end up being a big, big deal later on. Turkey at this time is also transitioning from a producer of raw opium to a wholesale supplier, especially in the 60s when the Turkish government, under pressure, started cracking down on opium growing. And what that means is that Turkey is no longer really growing it illegally, but serving as a major transshipment point with the flow of opium coming from other countries, mostly Afghanistan. Think of it as like, they were Colombia for a minute, but now they transitioned into being Mexico. Much like Mexico is the gateway to America, so, the coke flows through there, Turkey is the gateway to Europe, so the opium and heroin flows through there. And in 1971, the year that Senator is busted, there's a breakthrough for the U.S. when Turkey submits to U.S. pressure and bans the production of opium, though it actually reverses that ban in 1974. So it's only a couple years that it's banned, but during those few years, there's a whole new smuggling economy that opens up. And that's around the time you have the Baybasin family getting in on the game. I guess it could be viewed as how, Prohibition created a lot of mafias or boosted the ones that were already there that were operating.
Yeah, this is like the inception of the US war on drugs, right? When the Bureau of Narcotics was turning into DEA, and Washington is kind of flexing its muscles, getting drugs banned all over the world. We got into it the episode on cannabis in Nepal. It's the opium in the Golden Triangle. This early 70s are pretty much the gilded age for half the episodes we do on drugs. And if you want to get real geeky, you can look up stuff on WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks has some incredible information on how confused heads of state and government insiders were at this time. They didn't know whether they were supposed to ban stuff or kind of push people into crop substitution things. It was a crazy, crazy time. And yeah, tons and tons of mafias came out of it.
In 1974, when Turkey overturns the ban, they only overturn it to allow state licensed growing operations to be sold to the medical industry. There's no more free for all. And I think this is still actually a thing, right? The opium for painkillers being grown in certain heavily secure areas of Turkey.
Yeah, yeah.
That is right. There are fields down there, aren't there? I feel like I've read stories.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, they still do that. Huge.
Yeah. There's always a story about a backpacker 20 or 30 years ago who tried to break in and steal some. I think, I feel like I read a story about that somewhere.
Was it you?
No, it's not me. Luckily for the Baybasin clan and other smugglers during the time, there's plenty of opium being grown in Afghanistan to be smuggled into Turkey through Iran on these established routes that have been there for generations. And this also coincides with the French connection being broken up. And that opens up the door for Turkish organized crime groups to fill that vacuum in the heroin market. And this new set of big-time players emerges. They start establishing different trafficking routes into Europe through countries like Germany and Bulgaria and connecting directly with European buyers, as well as utilizing the growing Turkish and Kurdish expat communities in Western Europe for their distribution on the local level. And we also start to see even more allegations of Turkish officials either being directly involved or being bribed so that they let it go. We're talking late 70s, early 80s here, and Hussein's clan is making power moves. He takes his first trip to Western Europe in 1982, using his personal network to start setting up distro points in Holland, Germany, and the UK. Hussein is getting lots of his family involved as well, cousins, brothers, all that. Here's Mark Galeotti, who wrote the book on the Russian Mafia that we've talked about a lot, and he kind of looks like an older version of Sean if you squint.
Whoa. Hold on. Mark, I love your work. I think your books are great, but yeah, I don't look like you, and I think that Danny might be having a breakdown.
Quote, the Baybashins represented an interesting transitional case in that they rose as old-fashioned babas and relied on kin relationships for recruitment and loyalty as they rose to power. But they proved willing to step outside that and attract and promote outside their personal circle. They blended traditional charismatic leadership with a managerial approach that emphasized efficiency and advancement by results, which helps explain their rise within a Turkish criminal milieu, which until that point had often been characterized by amateurism, tradition, and clientelism. Also, it's not just heroin, right? These guys are later involved in arms smuggling, extortion, and fun things like that. They're said to be sophisticated, but also brutal. No strangers to taking out rivals or forging alliances with other criminal groups. Hussein is the mastermind. He's ordering killings and plotting out logistics, and he's sharp. He's a businessman who demands absolute loyalty. He starts getting known as the Emperor or the Heroin Emperor, and his family adopts a hierarchical mafia-like structure, with him on top and his brothers as key lieutenants, including Abdullah, who we're going to talk about a bit at the end of this. They're basically referred to as the Turkish Mafia, with others simply calling them the family.
I feel like being called the Heroin Emperor could come back to bite you if you got arrested. That could be an issue.
Yeah. If that's your nickname that starts up, then doesn't bode well. By the 1980s, Afghanistan is now becoming a major opium/heroin producer. And the Balkan route, which takes the product from Afghanistan into Iran, then through the mountains into Turkey and then into Europe, is becoming a major drugs route. The heroin smuggled into Turkey would then have two different options. One was through Bulgaria, Romania, and Hungary, then Central and Eastern Europe, and then Western Europe. And the other was through Greece, Macedonia, and Albania, which usually went to Italy and the rest of Western Europe.
Yeah, I wonder if the remnants of these like drug smuggling groups ended up re-upping their work through the European migration crisis, because those are the exact same routes that migrants were taking from like Turkey and Syria when that was kicking off into Europe. Just wonder if they were the same groups, maybe.
I mean, it makes sense because, right, we have, obviously, the cartels in Mexico are all involved in smuggling operations with people because there's a lot of money. And I remember the numbers for Turkey were super expensive too, moving people through Turkey into Western Europe. But I don't know, they might have disappeared, it might be a younger man's game at that point. But I assume the routes were there because they're the easiest way to move people through those areas. And
I mean, they might just be like roads cut through mountains, right?
Yeah.
They could just be simple as that, but yeah.
I mean, we are talking about billions of dollars of product moving along those routes, and the Baybashins are becoming the major players. And one big reason for that is that they lock in with the PKK, who are active in and basically control the mountainous border region where Turkey and Iran intersect. And the discussion around the PKK involvement in this trade kind of reminds me of the one I had with Toby Muse back in our episode about the FARC from a month or two ago. I mean, look, there's a lot about the PKK that gets exaggerated when it comes to the drug trade, but they definitely taxed and charged for protection from traffickers like Hussein and his family. And in some cases, they reportedly engaged directly in trafficking and distribution. US and European police have accused them of it, and of course the PKK denies the allegations. With Hussein, the relationship with him and the PKK looks to be him paying protection money and also donating funds, while they also had a sort of mutual interest in influencing the Kurdish communities in Europe. By the mid-1980s, the Baybashin family is well established in the heroin trade, operating a sophisticated network that stretches from Afghanistan to Turkey and all over Europe. They're involved in everything: production, smuggling, and distribution, all levels. They even begin investing their profits in legitimate businesses, hotels, resorts in Turkey, even a hotel in Brighton in the UK. But something happens in 1984, and that's where things get a little murky. Hussein gets knocked in Dover in the UK on a serious drug trafficking charge. He's caught with 6 kilos. I think he was using a fake passport at the time. He's convicted and sentenced to 12 years in prison. He starts serving his sentence in the UK, but after 3 or so years, he's transferred back to Turkey to finish serving his sentence. Multiple sources say similar things, but he's either released immediately after getting back to Turkey or after serving an additional 4 months. Either way, it ends up being a very short sentence. And there are some claims that the Turkish government had pushed to have the UK release him back to them, to have him extradited, just so they could let him go.
I mean, if you know Kent, which sadly I do, the idea that this multinational kingpin was brought down in Dover it's just quite funny.
Why? I don't know the region.
Dover is not the place that you would expect a thrilling drug caper to reach its conclusion. But, maybe I've been to the wrong pubs. I'll give it that.
Can you make a U.S. comparison?
Dover, what is a shitty, tiny port town in the middle of nowhere?
That's a good question. I have no. Maybe somewhere like Wilmington?
Yeah, Wilmington.
Right?
That's a good one. Yeah, let's go Wilmington. Although Wilmington is also in Kent, which is funny. But yeah, Wilmington.
All right. Anyway, so of course, there's speculation that it's just run-of-the-mill corruption. Sure, at the highest levels of government, it could be, honestly, pretty likely. I spoke earlier about the allegations of various Turkish officials being involved in the heroin trade, and that's generally the case with, most countries that are massive producers or transshipment points for drugs. There's nothing out of the ordinary with that. And then there's the way, more than a decade later, Hussein himself will describe it. Keep in mind, these are his words. It's not verified or conclusive, but he claims that he was able to become such a powerful trafficker by this point, preceding the arrest, because he had the cooperation and support and the protection of the Turkish government or elements of the Turkish government for his drug trafficking organization. This starts after that 1976 arrest when he claims he's approached by Turkish police to be an informant and a provocateur. He'll later state in interviews that Turkish embassies and consulates helped him move drug shipments across Europe, and that even Turkish army officers serving with NATO in Belgium were involved. He even went so far as to claim that, quote, the government kept all doors open for us and that they could, quote, do as we pleased. Now, why did they do this? Money, of course, is a big part of it, but also he says he was informing on the PKK and other drug traffickers, not just in Turkey, but also using his network in Europe to keep tabs on the Kurdish expat communities that were continuing to grow in Europe at this time. The PKK had major support networks in these communities in Europe, getting funding from them, political support, everything like that. And the Turkish government, of course, wanted to keep abreast of everything. And maybe more, they've been known to murder Kurds in Europe before.
There was an infamous murder, a triple murder actually, of 3 Kurdish women in Paris in 2013 too, all shot in the head over the course of a single night. Mm-hmm. That was huge news back in the day, wasn't it? I remember that one. That was massive. There's been a bunch more, but the guy who killed them was a member of the Grey Wolves, which is this ultra-nationalist, far-right, Turkish supremacist organization. I don't know if you're going to get into them further down the show, but they could be their own episode, right?
Yeah, I mean, we are going to get into them a little bit, but some of their leaders, too, were essentially mafiosos who were far-right militants that were also hitmen for, the Turkish version of the CIA. So there's a couple of guys there that will pop up briefly in this episode. I don't go into it too much, but yeah, I mean, there's some wild stuff involved with them. I feel like, did you get into that in the episode on Sadat Peker?
Yeah, a little touched on them. They are pretty unsavory.
Yeah, not nice, not very nice. Hussein claims the Turkish government actually intervened with the UK after his arrest to get him sent back to Turkey to secure his release, expecting him to resume his role as an informant. But he says he had by then had sort of like a Kurdish awakening and refused to do so. His relationship with the government of Turkey then turns dangerous, and he becomes a target, and elements of the Turkish state then want him dead. And again, this is his story of what happened, and, there's some evidence for it, but he also has good reason to lie, which doesn't mean it's not true. But okay, we will get back to that because it all comes out in a big, insane trial a decade or so later. Let's get back to the drugs, lots of them. In the mid-'80s, Hussein's younger brother Abdullah is also getting more and more involved and getting a rep himself. In 1986, he's shot in a bar in Amsterdam and then confined to a wheelchair for life. But it doesn't stop him from instilling fear in the Kurdish and Turkish communities in London, where he is helping manage the network. He soon gets the nickname Apo, short for Abdullah Öcalan, the charismatic but also ruthless leader of the PKK. Hussein is then, according to Ryan Gingeris, caught along the border of Turkey and Bulgaria with 79 kilos of heroin in approximately, I think he says 1989. And I have not seen that mentioned elsewhere, even though there are a bunch of bios of him. And the whole situation with Hussein and the PKK and the Turkish government is just wholly confusing. He's said at times to be working with both of them. He's said to be working against both of them. Maybe all of it's true, and he was just playing whoever he could, getting money wherever he could, and using whoever and whatever he could to get as rich and powerful and in control as he could be. Here's a quote from Ryan. The real reason for his repeated run-ins with the law during the 1980s and 1990s, in Hussein's estimation, had more to do with his political sympathies than with his illicit dealings. His support for Kurdish and left-wing causes, he later admitted, started with the 1975 earthquake. As a result of the government's inaction in the wake of the earthquake's devastation, he and many other Kurds from the region drew closer to the gathering wave of resistance taking root in the region. He offered monetary support to the PKK from the proceeds of his drug transactions. His ties to the PKK, however, did not prevent him from seeking connections with members of Ankara's political elite. Ankara being the capital of Turkey, so what he means is that the political establishment in Turkey that was extremely anti-PKK. They were basically fighting a war against each other. So that's what I mean by the whole thing is kind of murky, right? This guy is playing both sides, and we'll see having some issues with both sides further on. Hussein also has said that Turkish death squads, like commandos, went after him repeatedly during this time. But as far as run-ins with the law go, in my opinion, the craziest and biggest one happens in 1992, and that's what you heard in our cold open. That's, of course, when we get the Kismet Team 1 incident with a cargo boat packed with thousands of pounds of opium or morphine base is pursued by both U.S. and Turkish authorities with the implication that they've been monitoring it for some time and are also on to Hussein and his whole operation.
If you're British at this point, I should just interject. You probably know Kismet from Lord Nelson, right? Because he was supposed to have said to his right-hand man, "Kiss me Hardy," as he died. But most people now think he was saying Kismet Hardy, as in it's my fate. Although I always thought this sounded like revisionism, because why not, if you're bleeding out on the deck of a ship, just say, kiss me on the lips, my friend. Sorry, I just think I just blacked out.
That's about as understandable to me as your cricket references usually are. But I'm sure
look at that guy on the top of the column in Trafalgar Square. That's the guy I'm talking about. He kissed his friend on the lips.
I'm sure, a good 7, maybe 8 of our listeners will get that reference. But our friend Hussein, the guy is sharp. He's sharp or he's Teflon or kind of neither, since he's already been caught a bunch and sent to prison. But either way, he dodges a bullet. The ship dumps the contents into the ocean, or actually the whole ship. They sink it. No harm, no foul, except for the loss of tens of millions of dollars of product. And the other minor drug lord who gets popped a few weeks later, that again we go into in the cold open. Hussein is no dummy. He knows he's being watched, and he's apparently on the DEA's radar. The Baybasins are smuggling heroin into the UK, the Netherlands, Belgium, Spain, and Germany, earning billions of dollars in the process, a major force in Europe's heroin market, if not the major force. At that point, they control a significant amount of heroin coming out of Afghanistan, which, in the early 90s, is the world's #1 producer of it. They're also just dominating the UK market. I think in the late 90s, they'll allegedly be behind 90% of the heroin being brought into the country, with a fortune that some estimate at $9 or $10 billion, though it's not really clear where the estimate is coming from. And to ensure that control, they recruit heavily from among the young men in the Kurdish and Turkish communities in North London, often teenagers, providing them with guns and money, and in some cases, apparently forcing them to join.
Yeah, Green Lanes represent. It really hasn't changed since either.
Yeah, that's going to be a big part in the second episode of this, when we're going to go into Abdullah and what happens there. There's a pretty chaotic, Royal Rumble that they have in 2002, but I'm getting ahead of myself. They also, at that time, when they're setting up in Green Lanes, they move into the protection and extortion rackets, taxing all the business owners in their community. Hussein, meanwhile, he sets up his home base in Amsterdam or in Holland, which also has large Kurdish and Turkish communities, which are perfect to recruit from. In 1994, and again, this is murky and there's conflicting accounts, some of it having to do with the brothers using fake papers, but one of the accounts says that that's the year that Hussein moves to the UK and applies for asylum as a refugee from Turkey. I think the claim was that he was a political refugee, fleeing Turkey due to the threat on his life. Another account has Abdullah, his brother, arriving in the country at the end of 1995 on a fake Dutch passport, but only applying for asylum a few years later when he's popped on a gun charge.
But this is a little confusing, right? Because if he had a Dutch passport, and this is all post-Maastricht in 1992, so that's when EU freedom of movement was enshrined. So he would have been free to do whatever he wanted in the UK in theory, although maybe he switched from his Dutch passport to the old original one. I don't know. It's all a bit murky anyway.
Yeah, I mean, different people report different times of both of them arriving in the UK, of Hussein being based in Holland or based in the UK, and it's kind of like a back and forth. But their whole rise in power and their whole sort of operation is very shady. Whatever the case, both brothers arrive in the UK to live in the mid-90s or so. The Baybasin clan, they buy a 6-bedroom house in Edgware, North London, which is apparently a nice neighborhood. Sean, please confirm. For £375,000, all in cash, which I'm going to go ahead and guess that, like, I don't know, in the mid-90s, that's what, like $1.5 million in the US in 2024? I mean, I guess that sounds right. You know, we're not really an economics podcast at all.
No, I think I know more about, like, Shanghai than I do Edgware, North London, but I'm going to say it's probably double that, actually. I think it's gone up quite a lot more, and 6 bedrooms in a fancy part of North London is going to set you back absolute bags. So yeah, 3 million, something like that.
Yeah, sure. Here's where things get interesting again. Hussein is allegedly then working for the UK Customs Office and MI5 as an informant, giving up info on corrupt Turkish politicians involved in the heroin trade. This information is going to come out a few years later during his brother Abdullah's immigration and asylum hearing. Well, someone testifies to that, though it isn't confirmed. Because of that work as an informant, the UK authorities supposedly offer the family sanctuary, despite them having caught a bunch of drug charges and being known internationally as major drug traffickers, which, you know, kind of makes me think that whoever said that is right, because why else would you give them sanctuary if you just Google the name and see the stuff about the ship? There's also claims that Hussein was working for intelligence services and informing on PKK activities in Europe. Here's a Guardian report from 2006, though it's talking about happenings a decade earlier. Quote, according to one witness statement sworn by a London businessman, a man linked to the family who's thought also to have worked as an informer for customs, an initial meeting to thrash out the plan was held with 2 named customs investigators in the Monument pub in the city of London. Hussein was brought into the country via South Africa, Morocco, and Gibraltar, and met undercover customs officers at a hotel near Tower Bridge. Quote, my understanding of the deal between customs and excise and Huseyin Baybasin was that he would provide them with information and that they would allow the family to come to the UK as they would be at risk in Turkey, the witness said. Now, one of the things that people like this tend to do when on trial or in general to others in their circle is claim they have some sort of like, you know, special assignment or privilege from the authorities. It's like a kid claiming to be working for the police or a secret agent when he gets in trouble. If you're a powerful person moving among other powerful people and you convince them that, well, actually, I'm tied in with the authorities, you know, I've got all these contacts and connections there, or even something like I've got someone on the take, it can do you quite a bit of good if they buy into it. At the same time, this was a guy who was already on the radar of multiple countries for being a drug trafficker. So how would he just be able to show up and move to the UK? I mean, it could have been fake papers, could have been bribes, but still, the whole situation, again, murky. Also at that time, Hussein is kind of the exact person the UK Customs would love to have as an informant. Why would this sort of information be prized by the UK in the mid-90s? I'm glad that you asked, Sean, because it's time for yet more indecipherable intrigue.
Oh, why would this sort of information... yeah, okay. Tell me.
Yeah, right on cue. In November 1996, there's an incident that blows the doors wide open on the Turkish deep state. Now, try to forget any conversations or noise about the deep state in America the last few years, because the phrase deep state, it actually comes from this incident, or it comes from Turkey in general. And what it refers to is this sort of shadow influence over the country and government by a collection of high-level officials in the government and military security services, all working in tandem with organized crime, mafiosos, and far-right militant groups to, in their mind, do things that benefit the country and for national interest. All of this stuff is off the books, and to finance it, they would do extra legal things, including using violence or trafficking major amounts of heroin to fund their covert activities. And, you know, those covert activities sometimes do involve murdering people. Basically, think of like any action movie where the government is like has a giant conspiracy and Tom Cruise is like, you know, unraveling it and being chased, or Will Smith, whatever. That was a real thing in Turkey. And nobody really knew about it until this bad car crash in this small town in Turkey in 1996. Because traveling together in that car is a bizarre lineup of people that should not be together. It's one of the top police officials in the country, a member of parliament who actually was Kurdish, but he was funding this sort of Kurdish group that fought against the PKK, and a major mafia figure who also happens to have been at one time the leader of the far-right nationalist militant group, the Grey Wolves, while also he was serving as a hitman for Turkey's version of the CIA. And also, there's a beauty queen. I don't think she factored much into the conspiracy, to be honest, but, she was there. These people together and their connections to even higher level government officials, it leads to this unraveling of this major scandal that rocks and shocks the entire country, exposing this working together between, the mafias, the far-right groups, politicians, the police, military, heroin traffickers, everything to do dirty, dirty things. In case you're confused, we all kind of are. But here's, I think, that same Guardian article, an earlier one, that breaks it down somewhat. Quote, Huseyin Baybasin would have been a precious asset for customs at the time that he was allegedly recruited as an informer, as he would have been privy to many of the secrets of those figures who inhabit what is known in Turkey as the deep state, the politicians, police officers, and intelligence officials involved in large-scale heroin trafficking. Side note, they were involved in a whole lot more, but they're just focusing on the heroin trafficking. Much is now known about this Turkish netherworld, in part because of an extraordinary incident in November 1996, in which 4 people, the head of the country's counter-terrorist police, a beauty queen with criminal connections, a politician known to be arming militia groups, and a heroin trafficker, were all killed when the Mercedes 600 in which they were traveling in slammed into a truck.
I feel like netherworld is one of those words you need to use when you've said underworld, mafia, crime far too much. I used to work for a music magazine, and we used to have to say songstress or wordsmith and horrible words like this. But shout out to netherworld. Maybe we should start using it a bit more. Does kind of sound like a sweaty pair of pants, but...
Oh, we're not finished with insane stuff involving the people in the car crash, because this is still from the article. The heroin trafficker, a man linked to the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II, was carrying a police identity card. 2 months later, a court in Germany found that a former prime minister of Turkey had been protecting heroin traffickers, an accusation that prompted official protests from Ankara.
Jeez.
So yeah, that heroin trafficker is the far-right militant and hitman who killed, Kurdish and leftist leaders, among others, on the orders of Turkish intelligence, who also paid him in heroin on occasion. The Pope thing, I think some people say he ordered it. It's one of the theories. I don't think it was ever actually proven. But, actually, this guy is one of the guys we were talking about who would make a pretty damn good episode.
Yeah, we actually skipped through the batshit car crash stuff in a 2021. That 2021 episode about Sedat Peker, that he was the gangster who was making YouTube videos, blowing open the deep state back then, 3 years ago now. I just looked him up. He's actually still kicking around. He's making accusations about the Erdogan government and organized crime. One time from Times Square. So maybe you walk past him on one of your many, many walks through Times Square that you have to do on a Sunday evening, Danny.
Yeah, could be. And I guess, that episode I think was, 2021. So, dozens of episodes ago. His reaction is very similar to and his connections to what Hussein, his whole situation.
Yeah.
That Hussein was airing this stuff out before anyone had ever heard of it. Whereas Sadat is kind of basically like sort of bringing up the same exact stuff, maybe with a different government.
I don't think he's as big time as this guy either. No.
But yeah, the heroin trafficking, that's the most important part of this scandal for us. Because, spoiler alert, after he's arrested a few years later, Hussein's going to claim that he was operating as a heroin trafficker mafia boss for the state, at the direction of the state, and with its help, and that they turned against him when he refused to keep helping them. But I guess we even mentioned that earlier on in the episode, so not even a spoiler alert needed. In one interview, Hussein even details how certain Turkish officials came to speak with him and helped him get money at banks to finance his drug trafficking. Quote, "The same thing happened at the bank. I didn't even realize it myself that it was also the state itself organizing it. But in some cases, we were told that the money was intended for development of the state. Half the money from every transaction went to the state. To us, it was kind of a tax, in exchange for which we received protection in all aspects. If the money was confiscated or we were arrested, then our contacts with the government came to fetch us and said that we worked for the state. They even protected us in Europe. When I made a second trip to Europe that year, I saw for myself how all the consulates were involved in the trafficking. There was a member of staff at each consulate for that purpose." Okay. Any questions? Are we all following here? Let's now go back to Europe in the
I'm good.
Yeah. Okay. We're going back to Europe in the mid-90s. Oasis are climbing up the charts. A young Sean Williams has developed an addiction to shoplifting, and law enforcement in the UK are circling around Huseyin Baybasin. So he books it to Amsterdam to set up his base of operations, figuring its more lax drug culture and law enforcement would give him some breathing room. Baybasin by then is facing increasing scrutiny. He's become this sort of notorious criminal figure. The British are trying to just shut down his entire operation, but since it's all over Europe, it's very complex and quite international, they need help. So they begin intelligence sharing with the Dutch, Belgian, and German security services. They all come together and they plan something called Operation Black Tulip, which is, a funny name, with the Dutch and tulips and whatnot. Like, I bet the guy who thought of that in the meeting was super hype. On March 27th, 1998, at 7 a.m., Dutch authorities surround Hussein's secret mansion in a small village in the south of the Netherlands. They're able to arrest him and one of his nephews with no sparks, no clash, despite both of them being heavily armed. He's then charged with drug smuggling, conspiracy to murder, and kidnapping, as well as just a litany of other crimes. Following that arrest, that's when Hussein starts talking, and that's when we get all the stories about the Turkish government first working with him and then targeting him. He publicly accuses high-ranking Turkish officials of involvement in the drug trade and alleges that he had been working on behalf of the Turkish government, acting as a, quote, diplomat and policeman. He does it in interviews with journalists. He does it in court. He's not shy about it. This is from a Guardian article, this one in 2002, quote, his defense, however, was not that he did not smuggle drugs, something to which he freely admitted during a newspaper interview before his arrest, but that he was acting on behalf of the Turkish government. I consider myself to be an official, a diplomat, a policeman, he told an Amsterdam newspaper. He admitted that his wealth came from heroin, but he said he became head of one of the world's biggest drug syndicates only with the full support of Turkish politicians, police officials, and the Turkish security service, the MIT. And, despite this whole, look, I did it, but a foreign government said it was okay, and they actually helped me do it defense, he gets convicted and sentenced to 20 years, which is later bumped up to life.
I feel like this man is not safe in prison if 1% of what he's saying is correct.
I do think there's some truth to what he's saying, not probably all, some, but he's still kicking and going and giving interviews, and he has a YouTube channel that I was looking at earlier. I'm not sure if it's actually him, but yeah, he's still there. But yeah, we're not done yet with the tale of the Baybasin clan because stuff is going to get crazier. He gives more interviews alleging that the trial was unfair and that the Dutch government collaborated with the Turkish government to frame him. He starts calling himself a political prisoner wrongly imprisoned. He even writes a book with a Dutch journalist telling his side of the story. And later, there's a Dutch professor who writes a book claiming that the voice recordings used during the trial were tampered with. Here's a segment from a Dutch newspaper article in 2014, quote, the author calls Baybasin's conviction one of the grossest miscarriages of justice. According to him, the criminal file of this case contains an excess of multi-manipulated taps. According to him, the Turkish and Dutch police and public prosecution service most likely collaborated in falsifying the taps. For his analysis, he mainly looked at 11 conversations that the court used as evidence. Of the thousands of tapped conversations, he only read the approximately 150 in English. The other taps concern conversations in Turkish and Kurdish. He does not speak those languages. So, a little tip from one journalist to another. If you only hear 150 of the taps, and there's literally thousands of others in a different language, hire people who speak those languages to hear the rest of them. Because, you don't know what's in there, dude. You don't know what the evidence in those taps is. It's kind of insane to just be like, oh yeah, I heard 150 of them. Here's my summary of the entire case. No, am I wrong, Sean? Help me out here.
You're not wrong. I'm just thinking about my own situations where translation is expensive.
Yeah, but he's a Dutch professor. He's clearly raking in the big bucks. Some in the Dutch media start describing Hussein as a businessman and freedom fighter, which, I'm personally very sympathetic to the Kurdish cause, but come on, man. There isn't much I would put past the Turkish government when it comes to Kurdish stuff, but your boy sold so much heroin, openly, for decades.
Yeah, but he did it for the kids, Danny. For the kids.
I think he did it for himself. And one thing I'm confused by, one of many in this episode, is that if his claim is that after his 1984 arrest, when he sent back to Turkey, after 3 years of a sentence, and he turns down this offer to keep being an informant and starts facing these threats because of it, he pretty clearly was trafficking large amounts of heroin in the 90s. Even if what he says is true, that would all be on his own accord. Anyway, With Hussein now locked up, and that starts in 1998, other gangs and drug trafficking groups sense weakness in his organization. And it's left up to his brother Abdullah, who's now running things on the street in North London and overall in the entire operation, to maintain control and take on any and all comers, which doesn't only include drug gangs and the police he has to deal with, because there's about to be a bloody split between the Baybasin organization and the PKK. And that's going to lead to a bloody war that kicks off in the early 2000s and is still being fought all over the world right now. And that, my friends, is what we are going to get into next week.
Very good. I'm not sure how I feel about you reporting on North London, Dover, and the Monument Pub, which is where I used to meet my brother-in-law for 5 p.m. Friday beers many, many years ago. But that is quite the story, man. If it's going to get madder, then I think people should be listening.
Yeah, I think it gets a little easier to understand. This was like a lot of the intrigue. Next episode is more just like, drug gangs trying to kill each other, a little bit of the PKK and the drug gang trying to kill each other. But it's much more understandable. And I wish I could have the answers to a lot of the stuff we did here, but I think it's important to tell you we don't know and give you sort of the different stories that have floated out there. But for more, as always, patreon.com/underworldpodcast. Sign up on Spotify, sign up on iTunes, email us if you have any problems, if you're Kurdish or Turkish and angry with me. Sean's email is sean.williams. No, I'm kidding. The Underworld Podcast at gmail.com. And until next week, thanks for tuning in.